The 13th century was an age when entire civilizations trembled at the whisper of a name, the Mongols. Born from the windswept steppes of Central Asia, this confederation of nomadic tribes had transformed in a single generation into the most terrifying war machine the world had ever known. Their rise was sudden, their impact catastrophic, and their legacy unforgettable. To kingdoms, caliphates, and empires stretching from China to Eastern Europe, the Mongols were not just an enemy, they were a force of nature, a storm of horsemen that devoured all in their path. At the heart of this empire stood Genghis Khan, a man who turned fractured clans into a disciplined juggernaut. But while his name became synonymous with conquest, it was his successors, Ojide, Monkey, and later Hulagu and Kublai, who expanded the empire into a colossal dominion that spanned continents. By the mid-1200s, the Mongol Empire stretched farther than any before it, from the icy forests of Russia to the burning sands of Persia, from the Great Wall of China to the gates of Hungary. It was said that a rider could travel from one end of the empire to the other without fear of bandits, for Mongol justice was as swift as Mongol wrath. And yet, behind the facade of order and unity lay a darker truth. The Mongols had perfected the art of psychological warfare. Before their armies even arrived, fear did the fighting for them. Refugees carried tales of entire cities erased from the earth, of rivers running red with blood, of towers built from the skulls of the slain. To resist the Mongols was to gamble not only with defeat, but with annihilation. Town after town, ruler after ruler, surrendered without a fight, hoping to avoid the fate that befell those who stood in defiance. But what made the Mongols so terrifying was not just their cruelty, it was their efficiency. Unlike most medieval armies, which relied on slow infantry and cumbersome supply lines, the Mongols were lightning incarnate. Their horsemen could cover astonishing distances in days, appearing where no army should be, striking before their enemies even knew they were at war. They carried no baggage trains, living off the land, drinking mare's milk, and even slitting the veins of their horses to drink blood if supplies ran thin. Each warrior carried multiple bows and a quiver of arrows, able to unleash a hail of death with terrifying precision while riding at full speed. Against such an enemy, medieval fortresses and traditional armies seemed almost helpless. Yet the Mongols were not merely horse archers of the steppe. They absorbed knowledge wherever they went, adopting siege technology from the Chinese, engineers from Persia, and even tactics from their defeated foes. No wall was too high, no city too strong. They could rain fire from catapults, tunnel beneath defenses, or unleash smoke and terror until morale crumbled. If brute force failed, deception followed, feigned retreats, false alliances, or even spreading plague-infected corpses into besieged towns. This was not war in the old sense. It was extermination as policy, terror as strategy, conquest as science. And yet, paradoxically, the Mongols were not blind destroyers. They understood that terror alone could not sustain an empire. Where resistance was met with annihilation, submission was rewarded with tolerance. Merchants found new safety along the Silk Roads. Scholars, artisans, and administrators were spared and even elevated. The Mongol Empire was both the destroyer of worlds and the creator of a fragile, interconnected Eurasia. It was the brutal paradox of their rule: peace through fire, order through fear. As the empire expanded, however, resistance inevitably flared. Not every city was willing to bow, not every ruler willing to kneel. Pride, faith, and desperation led some to gamble everything against the Mongol tide. For those who resisted, the consequences were unimaginable. It is here, in this tension between conquest and defiance, that our story begins. One city, proud, fortified, and defiant, chose to resist the Mongols, believing its walls and warriors could withstand the greatest empire on earth. What followed would become a nightmare so complete, so devastating, that its memory would echo for centuries. The night the Mongols arrived would not simply be a battle. It would be a warning written in flame and ash, a lesson to the world of what happened when defiance met the wrath of the steppe. Entire families, entire districts, entire histories, consumed in one merciless act of fire. The Mongol shadow had fallen upon them. And soon, the city would burn alive. The Mongols were infamous for inspiring surrender long before their armies arrived. Yet, not every city bowed its head. Some places, whether out of pride, desperation, or sheer defiance, chose to resist. Among them was one city whose rulers believed their walls, their warriors, and their faith could hold against the storm. This was no obscure settlement. It was a thriving hub of trade and culture, a jewel of its region. Its markets overflowed with silks, spices, and grains brought by caravans that crossed deserts and mountain passes. Scholars gathered in its libraries, poets recited in its courts, and mosques or temples, depending on which city one imagines, stood as monuments to its people's devotion. The city's population was vast by medieval standards, numbering in the hundreds of thousands. To its rulers, it seemed impossible that such a beacon of wealth and culture could simply vanish. But the Mongols did not care for wealth or beauty. They valued only submission. When their messengers arrived, carrying demands for tribute and loyalty, the city's leaders faced a decision that would shape its fate forever. To surrender meant survival, but also humiliation. To resist meant glory if they triumphed, and annihilation if they failed. The city council chose defiance. Their walls were thick and well-built, their armories stocked, and their people confident. Generations had invested in fortifications that towered above the plains, lined with towers and gates designed to withstand any siege. The defenders believed they had numbers on their side, for tens of thousands of soldiers manned the battlements. Behind those walls, families took comfort in the idea that stone and courage would shield them from harm. Yet their choice was not merely strategic, it was emotional. Pride burned in the hearts of the ruling elite. How could they kneel to horsemen from the steppe? How could they let their children grow up under foreign rule? Chroniclers tell us that priests or imams blessed the defenders, declaring their cause righteous. In the markets, townsfolk whispered rumors, some hopeful, others fearful. Some said the Mongols could not breach such mighty walls. Others recalled darker tales, of cities far richer, far stronger, reduced to smoking craters. Still, confidence prevailed. The city prepared. Blacksmiths worked day and night forging weapons. Archers trained upon the walls. Cauldrons of pitch were set aside to pour on attackers. Grain and water were stockpiled. To the people, it seemed as if they were ready for anything. They would meet the Mongols not with submission, but with resistance. And yet, even in these preparations, there was a shadow. Refugees had already arrived, gaunt and broken, carrying horror stories of other cities that had dared defy the Mongols. They spoke of fire raining from the skies, of streets running with blood, of walls crumbling beneath thunderous engines. Some whispered of the skull pyramids left behind as warnings. But their voices were dismissed as fear-mongering. After all, hadn't the city's walls stood for centuries? Hadn't they repelled countless raids before? Surely, this time would be no different. But this was not just another army. This was the Mongols. Scouts soon appeared on the horizon, small detachments of horsemen, dark silhouettes against the plain. They rode with the eerie calm of hunters, circling, studying, measuring every angle of the city's defenses. Behind them, the dust clouds of an approaching horde began to rise. The defenders, watching from the towers, felt the first chill of doubt. The enemy was not weeks away. They were already here. Still, the gates remained closed. The rulers of the city declared to their people that they would not bend the knee. To surrender would be cowardice. To resist would be honor. The die was cast. The Mongols had been defied. What the people of the city did not yet realize was that in choosing defiance, they had signed their own death warrant. Their pride had brought them to the brink of a nightmare, one that would not end with simple defeat, but with a destruction so total that even their memory would be scarred by fire. The Mongols had arrived. And the siege was about to begin. The Mongols did not waste time. Once their scouts had completed their work, the vast horde encircled the city like a tightening noose. To the defenders on the walls, the sight was terrifying, countless horsemen stretching to the horizon, banners snapping in the wind, and siege engines rolling into position. The calm confidence that had filled the city only days earlier now wavered. The siege had begun. The first weapon the Mongols unleashed was not stone or fire, it was fear. They understood that terror could break an enemy faster than arrows. Envoys rode once more to the city gates, offering terms, surrender now, and perhaps lives would be spared. The rulers refused. The gates stayed barred. And with that rejection, the fate of the city was sealed. The Mongols struck with precision. Siege engines, designed by Chinese and Persian engineers who marched in their service, hurled boulders, flaming projectiles, and even pots of burning pitch over the walls. Massive stone shots smashed rooftops, while fire spread across crowded districts. The defenders retaliated with arrows, boiling oil, and stones of their own. The battlements echoed with the clash of steel and the cries of the wounded. 4 days, the city endured a relentless assault. Mongol archers advanced in waves, loosing volleys that darkened the sky. Their famed mobility allowed them to ride in, strike, and vanish before defenders could target them. Whenever the city's soldiers attempted a sally through the gates, they were ambushed by swift cavalry and driven back in chaos. The Mongols controlled the battlefield beyond the walls, cutting off any hope of reinforcements or escape. Inside the city, life began to crumble. Food supplies, once thought sufficient, dwindled rapidly under the stress of so many mouths to feed. Wells ran dry as siege engines shattered aqueducts. Smoke hung heavy in the air, choking the citizens and dimming the sunlight. Refugees who had fled into the city now became an unbearable burden, their hunger and fear spreading unrest. The Mongols employed every weapon in their arsenal. They tunneled beneath sections of the walls, attempting to collapse towers. They catapulted corpses of plague victims over the walls, using disease as a silent ally. Night after night, drums pounded in the darkness, robbing the defenders of sleep, reminding them of the endless army waiting just beyond their gates. Chronicles described the defenders' growing despair. Soldiers once proud and confident now muttered doubts. Families huddled in fear as fire spread from rooftop to rooftop. Religious leaders urged the people to stand firm, promising divine deliverance, but even their voices grew strained. The Mongols, by contrast, showed no weakness. Their discipline was unmatched. Campfires dotted the plains like stars, their horsemen drilling even in the night. To the defenders, it seemed less like an army of men and more like a supernatural force that could not be stopped. Weeks turned into months. Starvation began to take hold. Bread was rationed, livestock was slaughtered, some whispered of cannibalism in the darkest alleys. The city, once a proud beacon of trade and learning, was slowly strangled by the iron grip of the steppe warriors. Still, the gates did not open. The rulers clung to defiance, even as their people suffered. The hope that someone, an ally, a distant king, or a divine miracle, might come to their aid kept resistance alive. But no help arrived. The Mongols had made sure of that. The siege had become a war of attrition, and the defenders were losing. Every day that passed tightened the noose, every night drained the strength of the starving, desperate population. The end was no longer a question of if, only when. The Mongols had been patient. Now, they were ready to deliver the final blow. The siege had dragged on for weeks, perhaps months. The defenders were starving, exhausted, and desperate. The Mongols, on the other hand, had grown stronger, more coordinated, and more determined. And then, one fateful night, the sky itself turned against the city. It was the night the Mongols unleashed their most terrifying weapon, fire. The decision was deliberate. The Mongols had long mastered the art of destruction, but fire was more than just a weapon, it was psychological annihilation. While stones shattered walls and arrows pierced flesh, fire consumed everything indiscriminately: homes, temples, libraries, and the very soul of a city. That night, the Mongols intended not only to conquer, but to erase. As dusk fell, silence descended on the plains outside the walls. The defenders, peering anxiously from their towers, noticed an unusual stillness among the besieging camp. Fires burned low. Drums were silent. For a moment, some dared to hope the Mongols were withdrawing. But then, as the last traces of daylight vanished, the preparations became clear. Siege engines were wheeled forward, their frames creaking under the weight of their loads. But these were no ordinary stones. Bundles of pitch, oil-soaked rags, and incendiary materials were packed tightly, ready to be hurled over the walls. Suddenly, the night erupted. Flaming projectiles arced through the darkness, leaving trails of fire that illuminated the sky like falling stars. They crashed into rooftops, marketplaces, and courtyards, igniting infernos that spread uncontrollably through the city's dense wooden structures. Within moments, entire districts were ablaze. Panic swept the defenders. Families screamed as fire tore through their homes. Soldiers abandoned their posts to rescue loved ones, or simply fled from the unbearable heat. The flames roared with a life of their own, crackling, twisting, devouring everything in their path. Smoke blotted out the stars. The city that had once stood proud and defiant was now a furnace. The Mongols pressed their advantage with ruthless precision. As the fire raged, their siege towers rolled forward, their ladders raised, and their troops stormed the walls. Blinded by smoke, choked by heat, the defenders fought desperately, but their discipline had shattered. The flames had already broken them before the Mongol swords even struck. Everywhere was chaos. Mothers clutched children as they ran through smoke-filled streets, only to find escape routes blocked. Wells ran dry as citizens tried in vain to douse the flames. Horses stampeded in terror, trampling those in their path. The crack of collapsing roofs echoed like thunder as neighborhoods vanished in sheets of fire. The Mongols had calculated every detail. Fire drove the defenders into confusion, making coordinated resistance impossible. Escape was cut off, gates surrounded, and the night sky lit with the glow of destruction. For the Mongols, it was not only victory, but spectacle. Survivors would carry tales of this inferno to other cities, spreading the terror more effectively than any army of messengers. Some chronicles describe the scene in haunting detail: the screams of tens of thousands trapped within the flames, the sight of children hurled from burning walls, the rivers running black with ash and red with blood. To the Mongols, this was strategy. To the world, it was a nightmare. And yet, amid the horror, there was a grim beauty. Witnesses wrote of the fire as if the heavens themselves had descended, engulfing the city in divine punishment. From miles away, travelers could see the glow on the horizon, mistaking it for sunrise. But it was no dawn, it was the death of a city. By morning, resistance was gone. The once mighty walls still stood in places, but inside, there was nothing left to defend. Ash covered the streets. Bodies lay charred and broken. The air reeked of smoke, blood, and despair. The city had been consumed in a single night, its defiance repaid with utter annihilation. For the Mongols, it was just another victory in their relentless march across the world. But for the people who lived and died there, it was the end of everything. The Night of Fire was not merely the conquest of a city, it was a message to the world. To resist the Mongols was to invite destruction so complete, so merciless, that nothing but ashes would remain. When dawn finally broke over the smoldering ruins, the city was unrecognizable. Where once there had been bustling markets, towering gates, and proud temples, now lay a blackened wasteland. Smoke curled into the pale morning sky, carrying with it the stench of charred wood, burnt flesh, and shattered dreams. The Night of Fire had not just destroyed buildings, it had erased an entire way of life. The streets were littered with the dead. Some had been slain by Mongol blades, others consumed by flames, and countless more crushed beneath the collapse of their own homes. Survivors stumbled through the ruins like ghosts, coughing from the smoke, their faces streaked with soot and grief. For them, survival was no victory. They had lost families, neighbors, and the very city that had once defined their lives. The Mongols moved swiftly among the wreckage. Their soldiers showed no mercy. Those who resisted to the end were executed. Skilled artisans, scribes, and engineers were separated and taken into captivity, to be carried eastward in service of the empire. Women and children were herded together, many destined for slavery. And countless others were slaughtered, their bodies left to rot as a grim reminder of Mongol wrath. Yet even in their cruelty, there was a method. The Mongols believed terror was a tool as powerful as any weapon. By destroying one city so completely, they sent a clear message to all others: resist, and you too will burn. To neighboring rulers, the message was unmistakable. Some surrendered immediately upon hearing of the city's fate, offering tribute before a single Mongol arrow was loosed. Others fled, abandoning fortresses and leaving populations defenseless rather than risk total annihilation. The empire itself reaped rewards from such devastation. Wealth looted from the city was redistributed among Mongol generals and warriors, fueling loyalty and ambition. The captured artisans strengthened the empire's administration, building bridges, crafting weapons, and copying manuscripts for their new masters. Even in ruin, the city contributed to the growth of the Mongol world order, though never on its own terms. But the cost was immense. The city, once a jewel of culture and commerce, vanished from the map. Its libraries were gone, its monuments reduced to rubble, its traditions scattered. Centuries of knowledge and artistry were lost in a single night of flame. To later historians and chroniclers, this destruction became both a tragedy and a warning of the Mongols' unparalleled ferocity. The emotional toll reverberated far beyond the city's walls. Refugees who escaped carried their grief and horror into other lands. They told stories of fire raining from the sky, of children burned alive, of skulls piled in pyramids outside the gates. These tales spread like wildfire, magnifying the Mongols' reputation until they seemed less like men and more like demons sent from the steppes. And that reputation was precisely what the Mongols wanted. Terror was not an accident, it was strategy. By burning one city alive, they subdued a dozen others without lifting a sword. By turning defiance into ash, they transformed fear into a weapon of empire. Yet for those who lived through it, there was no strategy, only loss. The ashes of their city bore silent witness to the cost of pride and resistance. Where once music, laughter, and prayer had filled the streets, there was only silence, broken by the distant hoofbeats of Mongol riders moving on to their next conquest. The city was gone. But the memory of its destruction would endure, etched into history as both a tragedy and a lesson. In the age of the Mongols, defiance carried a price that few could afford to pay. The destruction of the city was not the end of its story. In many ways, it was only the beginning. The ashes left behind became more than ruins, they became a symbol, a warning etched into the memory of an entire era. Wherever the Mongols rode, the mere mention of what had happened here spread ahead of them, faster than their horses could gallop. For rulers across Asia and the Middle East, the lesson was clear: resist, and you risk annihilation. Entire kingdoms surrendered without a fight, opening their gates and offering tribute rather than face the same fate. The Mongols understood this dynamic perfectly. They did not need to destroy every city, only enough to ensure that fear itself became their most powerful weapon. The city's fiery end was thus woven directly into the empire's strategy of domination. And yet, paradoxically, the Mongols also built from the ashes. The artisans and scholars they spared were carried across the empire, strengthening Mongol rule in China, Persia, and beyond. Roads became safer under Mongol protection, trade flourished along the silk routes, and cultural exchange spread ideas further than ever before. In this sense, destruction and creation walked hand in hand. The same empire that burned libraries also ensured merchants could travel thousands of miles in relative safety. The paradox of the Mongols was stark: they were both destroyers and unifiers. The memory of the city's fall lived on in chronicles, poetry, and folklore. Historians wrote of it with horror, religious leaders used it as a moral warning, and common folk passed down stories of fire that blotted out the stars. Even centuries later, the city's fate became shorthand for ultimate devastation. Modern scholars see in it a lesson about power, fear, and ambition. The Mongols demonstrated that war is not only fought with swords and arrows but with psychology, reputation, and spectacle. By burning one city alive, they reshaped the politics of an entire region. And so, the legacy of fear and fire remains. The ruins may have crumbled, but the story endures, echoing across history. It reminds us that empires often build their glory not only on conquest and innovation but also on ashes and silence. The Mongols moved on to new horizons, but the city they burned alive remained forever in their shadow, an eternal warning of what happens when human ambition meets human defiance in its most ruthless form.